Hey, I got my haircut short. So until a few days ago, I had long hair when one day it was scorching. Like it's so hot in India at the moment, I cannot even tell you. So I had to go and take a head bath that day. That is, I had to also shampoo my hair. And I don't know, but thinking the amount of effort and hard work that would go into washing those long, luscious curls, I got lazy. So I did what anyone sane would have done in my position. I took a pair of scissors and chopped off my hair. And here we are. So a couple days later, then I went to a salon and got my hair trimmed, and this is the result. But I know that's not what you're here for, so is sex work really work? This is a controversial topic, and I don't think I'm qualified enough to talk about it. Nonetheless, I'll give my thoughts. First, I'll talk about what is sex work, how the sex industry emerges by looking at Imperial China through the anime, the Apothecary Diaries, the kind of people that partake in it, its consequences, and finally, do I support it? Okay guys, I want you all to take a guess on what my opinion is going to be on this and write it down in the comments. But without further ado, let's begin. What is sex work? So sex work, also known as sex trade, is when a person sells sexual services for money. It's legalized and regulated in some parts of the world. However, in other parts where it's illegal, it drives sex workers and their clients to the underground. However, the sex industry still exists. People also call it prostitution, and some sex workers take offense to this term, as prostitution has the connotations of criminality and immorality. However, a lot of other former participants that have come out of this industry share their horrible experiences and say that it's no work but exploitation, and it should be called what it really is: prostitution. So there you have it. Now let's look at the sex industry of the Imperial China through the lens of the anime, the Apothecary Diaries, and see how sex sells. A quick summary of the anime would be that maomao, an apothecary, that is a person who is licensed to make medicines and drugs, lives in the Hanamachi, or the pleasure district. Why is it called the pleasure district? It's filled with one brothel after the other, and it's the epitome of a flourishing and a thriving sex industry. And among all these brothels lies the one, the widely exclusive, the widely acclaimed, the one brothel that only the widely rich cream of the crop can afford: the Word-Degree House. And not to mention the three princesses of the Word-Degree House: Pyrene, Maomao, and Joka. They are the unattainable worshipped goddesses whose attendance, that is just their presence, can cost a year's worth of salary of even the higher officials.
六章間の三姫といえば民からも承継を集める雲の上のアイドルだからな。一目会えることですら名誉になる存在だ。
The middle class can only gaslight themselves into thinking that the three princesses aren't all that, since that's an easier fact to digest than the fact that they cost more than their entire life. And the working class? Psh, how could you even consider them in this equation? The fame of the three princesses has reached far and wide, enough to be inspiration to younger girls who enter this industry just to be like them.
そんな存在に憧れ遊郭の門を叩く娘もいるが簡単になれるものではない。
And this brings me to the first observation. Not all workers in this industry are forced. And a qualitative research done in Iran on why a lot of women participate in the sex industry, two of the reasons out of the numerous others were narcissism and materialism. Some women just loved being the center of attention and to look pretty for men. They loved to be desired as it boosted their confidence. It's a classic example of patriarchy's programming, where a woman's worth is determined by how desirable she is to a man. And even as times are progressing, this mindset is still kinda hardwired in us, as it's fed to us ever since we were kids. And materialism, because the work pays good. Some women said that they just wanted to be wealthy and decided to capitalize the beauty that God had bestowed on them. In an article by Guardian that shared excerpts from both the clients and the workers of the industry, one woman shared that she would charge a whopping £120 per hour. That's like 12,000 INR. Another man shared that a prostitute he would meet up with frequently would charge him 3,000 pounds a night. That's like 300,000 INR. It's a crazy sum of money, and all this monetary promise lures women into this job. Coming back to the Apothecary Diaries, the clientele of the three princesses is the ruling class, the finest people.
その上、一晩の尺で一般の給金1年分の銀が消える。6召喚の3姫をまとめて呼びつけるとは、金とはあるところにはあるものである。
They are these untouchable, exclusive women who lead lavish lifestyle with never lacking anything. So, very early on in episode 1, Maomao is kidnapped and gets sold off as a servant to the emperor's castle. She's deployed to work in the rare palace, which is where the emperor's concubines and their ladies-in-waiting lived. No man besides the emperor, his kin, and eunuchs, that is men who have got their penises chopped off, can enter the palace, and the palace serves as the emperor's flower garden where he can pick and choose his concubine for the day, who would also be his baby making machine. There are 2,000 women living in the palace, and if one concubine has 20 ladies in waiting, there are still 100 concubines in total. It's the site of Imperial Harem, and all these concubines' loyalty should lie with thy holy emperor. Now, this brings me to another interesting observation that I would also like y'all to notice. If your origin lies in a higher economic class, then you become a concubine for the emperor. If you're poor, then you become a prostitute for a brothel. And this is something even Maomao comments on.
御殿も花街も大して変わらないな。できれば高級なんて一生関わりたくなかったが。
For example, out of the 100 concubines, there are 4 that are given a special status by the emperor. One of them, Gyokuyo, is a member of the Yu clan, a prominent clan that is favored by the emperor who oversees the empire's western province. Gyokuyo is famed for her jade green eyes and red hair, and she, like all the other concubines, is selling her beauty to enhance her sex appeal in order to be the emperor's wife, a position that will unlock power and influence not just for her but for the Yu clan too. And this is all the result of capitalism. Capitalism requires a worker to provide labor not just for self-sustenance but labor that can be profited off of. People who fail to provide the said labor provide sex. They put their body and its components as the commodity to be sold in the market. Now the question is, what kind of people would be so desperate as to rely on sex? People who got no other skills. Or I should say people who got no access to gain and learn those other skills. People who are uneducated, poor, or deprived. Basically, people who are oppressed and marginalized. Coming back to the Iranian study that I talked about, one woman said that even though she entered the industry on her own will, she did it because she was not well educated and couldn't apply for professional jobs. Coming back to the Apothecary Diaries, it's the time of Imperial China when education was largely reserved for upper-class men. And it's established in the very first episode of the series as Maomao is the only servant girl that could read.
今日はこれで解散だ。
そうか、この中で文字を読める下女は私だけ。それをあぶり出すためにあの書き物を。
Now, this may lead us to another interesting question, which is why then decently educated women like Gyokuyo choose to be concubines for social mobility. Even though Gyokuyo arises from the Yu clan, her lineage is not noble. To climb the social ladder and to upgrade her family's social status, she must become the empress, and she's aware of it. She's wise enough to understand the politics of palace and the nature of her relationship with the emperor. And not just this, Gyokuyo also acts as a spy. She's well versed in topics of trade and finance and gathers information about the empire's situation from the palace.
和やかな会話の中で情報を引き出す玉葉様は、 穏やかそうに見えて、やはり妃だ。
She then relays this information to her family through letters to help them with their endeavors. This role of a spy could only be fulfilled by somebody who could access the inner palace, somebody who would look innocent enough, and somebody whose beauty could enamor the top dogs. As one of Emperor's favorite concubines, she holds immense power and influence. Now, of course, she could have helped her family with her knowledge in trade and finance, but there exists a large, viable market that would pay Gyokuyo handsomely for her beauty and her skills in bed. Sex industry is a legit industry here that adds into the economy. Then, in episode 3, maomao shares a story of this time when a prostitute was sold to a client in the verdigris house. However, the prostitute loved another client who could not afford her price. She still had a year left on her term, which prevented her from quitting and being with her lover. However, once the process of selling the prostitute had begun, she started to act uncanny at night. She would act possessed and mentally ill, which led to the client withdrawing his purchase of her, which further led to a sharp drop in her price.
その妓女には、後に新たな身請け話が持ち上がりましたが、病の妓女ということで、前の半分の銀で成立しました。
As the good of the market, the prostitute seemed to deteriorate in quality. Then some episodes later, Jinshi, one of the protagonists of the anime, asks Maomao on how to decrease the value of a prostitute. Maomao says that the more chaste and pure a prostitute is, the higher her price. If she's a virgin, it's going to burn your pockets to buy her. However, if she gets pregnant, her price falls down to a zero. And this right here is my biggest problem with the sex industry. Its foundations lie on objectification, commodification, and degradation of women. They're talked of as tools that should be exposed of once they are rusty. Sex here serves as a social currency, as a marker of one's value, and it's ironic that an industry founded on sex, the more you work, the more you provide your goods, labor, basically the more sex you have, the lower you're priced. Doesn't it run contradictory to common sense? After all, in all the other industries, the more experience you have, the more you're promoted. People like to celebrate sex work as women taking autonomy over their own bodies and expressing themselves sexually. However, is it really the case? Consent is always fleeting in this industry, and not just owing to or male violence, but even in this ironical sense that I just talked about. You cannot have unlimited sex if you want to, because that runs inversely proportional to your price, your value. If you have unlimited sex, you're priced less. In episode 6, the emperor hosts a garden party whose attendees were of course the 4 special concubines, along with army officials, strategists, and veterans. Now, there's a tradition that happens every time during the garden parties, which is that all these young, single, maybe married too, I don't know, it's not like harem is unheard of in this castle. Anyways, all these men could give personalized hairpins to the ladies in waiting that they fancy. This hairpin basically means that this particular virile man would like to have sex with this girl. However, it's the hidden meaning and it's not said out loud. The louder meaning of this hairpin is that this particular man can vouch for a lady in waiting's exit from the palace for a short period of time. Since these are all servants with specific tenure, they cannot leave the palace before their term is complete. Maomao, who was kidnapped in episode 1, wanted to use this opportunity to go back home and to assure her dad that she is alright. She gets a consolatory hairpin from one of the men named Lihaku. Consolatory because he was handing out the hairpins to all the ladies in waiting that felt left out or something, and he did not have a real interest in Maomao. Now, this brings me to the next very crucial argument of survival sex. Survival sex is when women don't consent to having sex, however, the circumstances around them and the desperation forces them into the activity. Fortunately for Maomao, Lihaku was not interested in her.
まったな、義理のかんざしを本気にされたか。さて、 どう断るかな
and decided to vouch for her regardless. But what if he was? Mao Mao on her own doesn't have the right over her freedom. She has to depend on a man to get that said freedom. What if Li Haku said that he would only vouch for her if she agrees to have sex with him first? Now, knowing Mao Mao, who's a very calm, collected, and a wise person, she would have figured out another way. But let's say that was not the case and she was desperate to go home and she agrees to his terms. Even now, when she's agreeing, it's not really consensual. She's forced into this activity because selling her body is the only way to gain her freedom. Hence, in Imperial China, there's no way sex work cannot exist when women have to rely on men for even their basic rights such as independence and autonomy. And survival sex is a very dark reality for a lot of women in this line of work. Also guys, there's this another very important point that I realized while editing I forgot to make, which is that the demand for sex workers leads to sex trafficking of both women and children. Think about it. If there exists a market for sex work and the supply cannot be obtained ethically, what are the capitalists who run the business going to do? In the Apothecary Diaries, we have a similar case with the virtuous consort Li Shu, one of Emperor's high consorts. So in episode 6, Mao Mao learns that Li Shu, who's 14 now, became a high consort to the previous emperor to raise her family's social standing, who died 5 years ago. 5 years ago, when she would have been 9, she was a concubine to this disgusting emperor who was a known pedophile. However, thankfully, the current emperor, who was still a prince back then, protected Li Shu and intervened whenever required so she would never have to sleep with the nasty ass pedo. Then once the emperor died and Li Shu had to leave the palace, her family again decided to use her for their political gain by betrothing her to another scum of the earth pedophilic governor. You see how Li Shu is literally being trafficked when she hasn't even hit puberty because there exists a demand for kids? Fortunately, the current emperor intervened again to make Li Shu a high consort, just a name, he never sleeps with her, so she could be safe in the inner palace away from her family's conniving schemes. So finally coming on to, do I support sex work? Honestly, for long I did not know where I stood in this matter because I cannot support an industry where a large chunk of women that form it have either been trafficked or forced. I cannot, in my good conscience, support an industry where the threat of and male violence is always looming. I cannot support an industry where consent is always fleeting. And I know a lot of people say that this is a common misconception about the sex industry, that sex workers lose their right to consent. However, there was this interesting and very obvious point made by this writer named Proletarian Feminist. In her article, where she talks about why calling sex work is problematic, she made this point about consent not being embraced in this industry, as the commodity being sold in the market is a woman's body and the sexual services she's willing to supply. If the demand in the market is of hardcore sex, and the woman is uncomfortable supplying it, she would still have to, or else she falls out of business. There's also always a power dynamic between the client and the prostitute. The latter is usually from discriminated and underprivileged backgrounds, and the former is usually from a privileged background. Hence, there's a power dynamic that's always lopsided in the favor of the client. And not to mention the numerous health code violations in this industry. Another article that I read, written by Rachel Moran, a former prostitute, she said that prostitutes are often exposed to other people's sweat, saliva, blood, urine, and sometimes even feces. So, no, I do not support this industry. Having said that, I also feel like women who are partaking in it, who are struggling to provide money for their families and themselves and bring money to the table by hook or by crook, who are partaking in this industry and hate it, but they have no other option, I feel like it's important to extend empathy towards them and shun judgment. They're really battling with life's odds here. And as for women who willingly do this work or even like this work, I just hope they entered this industry knowing what they were really signing up for and not having a romanticized version such as, oh, there's so much money in this without any physical or mental trauma. And if they want to do this work, ultimately, I'm no one to comment on this because it's their autonomy over their own life and I cannot snatch that. So for the longest time, I did not know which side of this debate I was on since I did not support the industry, but at the same time, I could not bring myself to rebuke the worker. However, proletarian feminist, she precisely explained what I felt that I could not put into words. Fight the industry and support the worker. Just because some industry can be broadly classified as work doesn't mean it should be embraced. And before I proceed further, I want you to take a look at this shot. Fight this industry and support the worker. Support the worker by providing them with the option to quit, by extending the opportunities of education and vocational training to the marginalized, by punishing traffickers, and by spreading awareness about what this job really entails.